There was an investigative journalist who was an atheist. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe that God exists, doesn't believe that there's a higher power, doesn't believe that there is somebody like a God. And his wife was an agnostic. Now, an agnostic is someone who's not sure if there is a higher power, if there is a God that exists. But one day, his wife came to saving grace in Jesus Christ and committed her life to Jesus. Now, this got this investigative journalist who was an atheist very, very upset. And so he did what any investigative journalist would do. He went on a mission to try to disprove the existence of God, disprove the claims of Christ, disprove Christianity as a whole, so that everything that his wife had committed herself to would come to naught. And after a year and a half of thorough study and investigation and research, he came to the conclusion that God exists. When he looked at the evidence, when he looked at everything that was out there, and he did his job the best that he could, he came to the conclusion that Jesus is real, that his claims are true, and that he also needs to submit to the lordship of Jesus Christ. That investigative journalist, his name is Lee Strobel. You might have heard his name before. He wrote a very famous book called The Case for Christ. Not only did he end up believing what his wife believed and proving some of the claims of Jesus, he became an ardent apologist, and he started sharing the good news of Jesus and writing apologetic works in order to prove that God existed and the claims of Jesus were real. Now, in this series that we're looking at difficult, hard, challenging questions in Christianity, culture, and in the society that we face, today we're looking at the question, how do we know that God exists? And as we look at this question, I can't prove for you scientifically or 100% that there is a God, but what my thesis is, what my claim is this. It is more rational to believe that God exists than that he does not. And so as we look at the evidence today, I want to encourage you to also look at the evidence. And maybe you're here and you're an atheist. You don't believe in God. Maybe you're here an agnostic and you're not sure if there is a God. Maybe you're here and you are a committed follower of Jesus. My hope is as we look at some of these things today that you will be affirmed in your belief and, as the apostle said, be able to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. And maybe there are some things that you haven't actually examined, and I hope that as we look at a few things today, it might sound a little bit like a science lesson today, but as we look at a few things today, that you would be encouraged to dig deeper into the claims of Christ, dig deeper into what the Word of God says, and dig deeper actually into some of the science behind the existence of God. Every faith system, whether you are atheistic, agnostic, or a believer in some religious system, is a faith, it is a belief. And so the question that I have to you, is it more rational to believe in God or more rational to believe that there isn't a God? Is it more rational to put your faith in Jesus or more rational to say there isn't a God that exists? My contention, my thesis, my hope, my presentation to you today is to show you that it is, in my opinion and in my belief, that it is more rational to believe that God exists than he does not. I think in the marketplace of ideas, as I've said before, that Christianity offers the best and greatest answers to some of the most tough and difficult questions that we have before us. Now, there's a few books that I'm going to be referring to, and this is on our website as well. You can go to uachome.org/take notes. All the quotes that I'm going to share and some of the books that I'm going to be sharing from are listed there. But I want to encourage you, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you can dig a little bit deeper into some of these books that are listed here. Timothy Keller, The Reason for God. C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision by William Lane Craig. The Problem of God by Mark Clark. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist atheist. That's a really good title, sort of similar here. How much faith do you have? Do you have faith to believe in Jesus or faith to be an atheist? Right? That's the contention here today by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. The Language of God by Francis Collins. These are all amazing and wonderful books that if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this topic, to have some hope or belief in what the Word of God actually says, these are great books to dig a little bit deeper into. Now, I referenced a couple of weeks ago a Christian philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga. He's in his 90s now, but we can actually thank Alvin Plantinga for bringing some of the Christian philosophies into the mainstream of science and theology. Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher that has argued very, very convincingly in mainstream science factions and talks and debates, to the point of some of the arguments that he has put forward have been accepted as rational philosophical arguments that have good proof to it. And so there's a book on our website that I recommend by Alvin Plantinga if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this. He points out that there is about 24 philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Now, I'm not going to go over the 24 today, but there are about 24 philosophical arguments for the existence of God. What I'm going to talk about today is about 3 different large categories of proof, evidence for the existence of God. The first is this: the question of morality. When we think about morality in our world, in our culture, in our society, within ourselves, how can we respond to the morality that we feel? Much of the work of this question of morality was actually pioneered by a man named C.S. Lewis in the book that I referenced, Mere Christianity. Now, C.S. Lewis was an atheist, or he was an agnostic, I think, turned atheist, and then turned eventually to theism. Part of it was his conversations with J.J.R. Tolkien, who's the author of The Lord of the Rings. You might have read the Lord of the Rings book or seen some of the movies. And through the conversations he had with J.J.R. Tolkien, Lewis came to theism, to the belief in God, to understanding that, yes, God exists. And one of the most convincing arguments that Lewis had, one of the things that really pushed him over the top was this question of morality. The moral value, the ethical values that we feel within us, what does that do for us, right? How do we obtain that? And as he wrote this book, Mere Christianity, is actually a collection of talks that he had given during World War II, during a time when there was huge violence around the world and Hitler's dominance was rising. C.S. Lewis was giving these talks on British radio, and they collected those talks together to be put together into this book called Mere Christianity. And the context is important because you have to understand the chaotic world that Lewis was living in at that time, for him to put these moral arguments together and to reason with people for the existence of God, the existence of morality. Have you ever used the phrase, "That's not fair," right? Have you ever used the phrase, "You promised," or "He deserved that," right? If you have small children, as I do, right, you'll hear some of those phrases all the time, right? She did this to me, or she did that to me. That's not fair, right? Where do we get this sense of fairness? Where do we get our sense of right and wrong? Where do we get our sense of morality, of good and evil and good and bad? I talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago when we talked about why do we go through evil and suffering in our world. But Lewis understood that there was some type of moral law that was there. He says this in Mere Christianity. He is appealing to some standard of behavior, talking about a person who is trying to reason with another person about fairness. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And so he's talking about this understanding that's within us, that is ingrained, that is birthed within us, this understanding of morality, this understanding of right and wrong. When we make statements like "that's not fair," when there is a challenge for social justice, a challenge to rise up for equality, to fight for the disenfranchised, where does all of that come from? Think about the events in our world in these past few years, the wars that are around us, the things that are happening in the Middle East and Africa in so many different countries, there's something that is crying out within us for justice and for righteousness, for peace, things that are within us that's crying out for equality, for hope, and for solutions in our world. Where do we get all of that? What is the reason for all of that? Where does this sense of morality actually come from? And in Christianity points towards a moral law and also a moral law giver. Points towards a moral law and a moral law giver. And that is within us. Now, there are lots of arguments against the moral law and a moral lawgiver. Two of the main arguments are this: relativistic understanding of morality and morality from evolutionary development. So let's talk about both. The first one, relativistic understanding of morality. This is when there is an elimination of absolute truth. There's an elimination of what is absolutely moral from the perspective of God, from the perspective of the Word of God. When each person determines what they feel is moral and what they feel is right. And this comes with so many challenges because as what one person feels is right, the other person might feel is wrong. For a culture or a place in maybe a number of years ago where people practiced cannibalism, and that was okay, and that was fine for their culture and their society, and we might look at that and say, that's terrible, how could you allow that to happen? Well, the moral law that we feel might seem different from the moral law that that person might have. And so if we have a relativistic understanding of morality, how can we say that that's okay? And that's why we have to understand the moral law that God actually gives to us. If one person's relativistic morals say that they can treat someone with a different skin color differently, or a different culture or a different background differently, can you say okay to that? Are you okay with something like that? The other argument is that it's morality from an evolutionary development. Now, there's a bunch of holes in this argument, but basically what it says is that we have this moral code within us that has come because of evolutionary development and the genes that we have. It's not from a supreme power or a higher being, but it's because of something that we've developed over time. Unfortunately, when you look at evolutionary development, you see that it is survival of the fittest. It is the best that survive. The weak are weeded out, and the ones that are strong survive. And so where do we get this altruistic feeling to support the weak and to support the disenfranchised and to help others? Because in an evolutionary framework, those people actually should be weeded out. Those people actually shouldn't continue. And so there's a lot of holes within this argument. There's a very famous book. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Harari. And in this, he traces the evolutionary development of mankind until humanity becomes the apex predator of the whole world. He traces through the development of the cognitive revolution. He traces the development of language and all of the different fightings and all the different things that went on, finally until mankind, humanity, Homo sapiens, becomes the apex predator, becomes at the top of the food chain, becomes number one in the world. And it wasn't by any altruistic feelings or by any sense of doing good to others. No, it was by killing others. It was by weeding out the weak. It was by a dog-eat-dog world. And if you read through the book, you'll see all of the different things that he explains and as he diagrams what has happened. And so to be able to say that our moral code and our moral understanding has come from evolutionary development has so many holes and so many things that is hard to understand. And just a lifetime ago, when Hitler was rising to power, he actually took this evolutionary framework to its final end. This is what he said in his book, Mein Kampf. If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one. Because in such cases, all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. He does not wish to fight in this world where permanent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist. And so he's taken this evolutionary framework and lived it out to its final end. And that's what has resulted in the Holocaust, what resulted in what he wanted to be a superior, dominant race of human beings. And so we have to look at these two sort of moral values, one from an evolutionary perspective and one from a theistic perspective of the moral code and the moral lawgiver. Francis Collin, in his book, The Language of God, Francis Collin was a scientist who was actually the director of the Human Genome Project and he was the one that led the mapping out of the whole human genome. He says this about agape or self-altruism. He says, agape or self-altruism presents a major challenge for the evolutionist. It is quite frankly a scandal to reductionist reasoning. It cannot be accounted for by the drive of individual selfish genes to perpetuate themselves. Quite the contrary. It may lead to humans to make sacrifices that lead to great personal suffering, injury, or death without any evidence of benefit. And yet, if we carefully examine that inner voice we sometimes call conscience, the motivation to practice this kind of love exists within all of us, despite our frequent efforts to ignore it. What he's saying here is that there's something within us that cries out for justice, cries out for equality, cries out for the disenfranchised, that we want to support those that are in need. There's something that is within us. There is an altruistic framework that's there that is completely opposite to the evolutionary framework that is presented to us. Self-altruism can't be a development of evolution because as someone lays down their life, as someone sacrificed for another, that person is going to be weeded out. When you think about the fact that Homo sapiens have become the apex predator of the world in an evolutionary framework, then it didn't happen through altruism. It didn't happen through self-sacrifice. It didn't happen because of someone laying down their life for someone else. No, it happened according to an evolutionary framework because of fighting and challenging and coming out on top. Self-altruism can't be explained by an evolutionary framework. In The Problem of God, Mark Clark says this: any notion of absolute good is what Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, calls a misfiring, a precious mistake. The problem with this explanation for good, as many have pointed out, is if we inherit our morality from genes wherein survival is the utmost consideration, many of our modern moral constructs are unexplainable and even counterproductive. For instance, why would laying down your life for people you have never met be considered heroic rather than stupid? Friends, when we look at the evolutionary framework, when we look at what it says to become the top, to become the apex predator in the world, when it looks at all of the evolutionary development, it is totally opposite to the moral framework that cries out within for altruism, for self-sacrifice, for loving others. Where do we get this moral code that is within us? Timothy Keller says this in his book, The Reason for God. For evolutionary purposes, however, the opposite response, hostility to all people outside one's group, should be just as widely considered moral and right behavior. That's interesting. That should be the moral framework. Hostility to everybody else. I want what's good for me and for my family. Everyone else, I don't care about you. That's the evolutionary framework. I want to do what's good for me so that I survive, not anybody else. That's what the framework should be. Not this thing that cries out within us for justice, for equality, for helping others, altruism. Yet today we believe that sacrificing time, money, emotion, and even life, especially for someone not of our kind or tribe, is right. If we see a total stranger fall in the river, we jump in after him or feel guilty for not doing so. In fact, most people will feel the obligation to do so, even if the person in the water is an enemy. How could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? How could we have that feeling within us? Such people would have been less likely to survive and pass on their genes. On the basic of strict evolutionary naturalism, the belief that everything about us is here because of a process of natural selection, that kind of altruism should have died out of the human race long ago. Instead, it is stronger than ever. Why? Friends, if we look at the evidence before us, I believe there is greater evidence to show that God exists versus that he doesn't exist. And this first thing about the question of morality points clearly to a creator. Mark Clark, in his book, The Problem of God, he shares two examples. In one example, he talks about him working with a co-worker at a retail store. And his co-worker said this: "I believe all morality is culturally constructed, relative, a product of our evolution, and that it's wrong for our Western ideals to be projected onto other cultures." Now, we're going to be talking about a few of these moral constructs in some of the questions that we're examining. Even tonight, Pastor Allison is going to be sharing about the Christian response to assisted suicide. Unless we have a moral framework that we can work from, we won't be able to answer some of these tough questions. And so as he was talking with his coworker, he said, "I believe all morality is culturally constructed. We shouldn't project our morality, our Western morality, on others." So then Mark Clark challenged him, and he said, "What if you traveled to a jungle and you got caught and your sister was killed and eaten? And that was their moral code. Would you be okay with that?" And he was put in a corner because he had to say yes. But was he really okay with it? No, he wasn't. But he had to say yes, because then his statement that all morality is culturally constructed would be wrong. And so he said yes, but it was quite obvious that nobody would be okay with that situation. He shared another example about in the 1960s and in the 1970s, there was a huge sexual revolution that was taking place. And in those decades, people were crying out for freedom, for liberty from the bondages or the oppressions that they had felt society had placed on their sexual liberties. And so they were crying out for that. They were fighting for that. They were advancing the cause of sexual liberty. At the same time, while they were saying, "Don't put your oppressive moral framework on me," they were also objecting to the Vietnam War that was taking place. And there was a contradiction there, to be able to say, "Let me be free and let me have my sexual liberties, but hey, don't get involved in that. You shouldn't be involved in that war. You shouldn't be doing those sort of things." They wanted to project their moral framework on somebody else. Can you have it both ways? No, you can't. And there is a disconnect that's there. And that's why people like C.S. Lewis and Francis Collins found the argument for morality so convincing that it brought them to theism, brought them to belief in God. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, it says this: "Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it." This is the moral law. They're not even Christians. They're not even followers of God. But the Gentiles even obey this law that is within them, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. And so, friends, when we see this moral code within us, you don't have to believe in God to have good morals. There are a lot of people that live very moral lives, that fight for justice, that fight for equality, that fight for the good of their fellow human beings, and they don't have any belief in God. But where do they get that moral framework? Where do they get that understanding for equality and justice? Where do they get this understanding of morality that's within them when they don't even follow after God? There's a lot of moral people that sometimes we might even say that live better lives than Christians. But where do they get that framework? Where do they get that understanding? Why do we see sin? Why do we see injustice? Why do we see inequality? And something within us cries out for the disenfranchised. Something within us cries out for the poor and the needy. Where do we get that moral framework? In The Problem of God, Mark Clark says this: "Morals are not a matter of mere taste or opinion any more than math equations. Human beings may not get the moral math problem correct, but that doesn't change the fact that there really is a right answer." And there is a moral framework, and although many people might not follow it, you can take the example of the cannibals in a tribe that's newly discovered. And they might not get it exactly correct, but just because it's not correct doesn't mean that there is an absolute right or wrong, as Clark says here in his book. He says, the very fact that something within us is repelled by racism, by sexism, by unequal treatment for the poor and disabled, begs the question that such convictions would have to come from somewhere, for they are not natural. This is a huge proof and evidence for the existence of God, that God has given to us a moral code, a moral law, and there is a moral lawgiver. These are contrary to nature convictions that point towards the rational existence of God. And Francis Collin, after seeing all of this, he says this: I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism, similar to Lee Strobel, who went out as an investigative journalist to disprove the existence of God, to disprove that God exists, to affirm his atheism. And Francis Collin did that. But then he said that now lay in ruins as the argument from the moral law and many other issues forced me to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis. Friends, if we look at the evidence before us, there's more evidence to show that a God exists versus that he doesn't. The second is the question of cosmology, okay? That means the stars in the sky and the space that's out there in the universe, the question of beginnings, the question of how everything started. And the book On Guard by William Lane Craig is a wonderful book to be able to investigate some of these things about cosmology. And William Lane Craig actually was one of the major proponents of what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, this was originally formulated by a Muslim theologian in the 12th century, but William Lane Craig is the one that really popularized this in the last century. And it goes by these three premises. The first premise is this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. And number three, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, the question to answer is, what is that cause, right? If you go outside after the service today and you see some coffee pots with coffee urns with coffee in them, do you just assume they just came out of nothing? No. By the way, we need more volunteers for coffee. I'll just throw that in there. So if you want to serve in making coffee and in our hospitality team, we would love for you to join. But that coffee didn't come by itself. Somebody had to make it. If you see something, right, the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Did this remote that I have just all of a sudden appear out of nowhere? No, it was made, it was formed, it had a beginning, it had a cause, there had to be some intelligent design behind it. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. For years, atheists and agnostics held on to the fact that the universe didn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end. They thought the universe was eternal. That was the majority scientific belief. Even Einstein, in his general theory of relativity, Francis Collins actually says in his book that Einstein included something called the fudge factor in his general theory of relativity because his theory actually proved that the universe was either expanding or contracting and that it didn't stay the same. And because Einstein had to make his general theory of relativity fall in line with modern scientific theory, he actually included the fudge factor in there, as Collins calls it, to make it work. Because at that time, the prominent belief was that the universe was eternal. It didn't have a beginning, and it didn't have an end. Einstein later said that this was the greatest mistake of his life in doing that. So later on, there was these two men, Alexander Friedman and George Latimer, and they actually took Einstein's equations at face value and tried to prove them. And in trying to prove them, they came to the conclusion that the universe was actually expanding. They didn't have any proof for that, but they just looked at Einstein's equation and said, this has to be the case. Then along came a man in 1929 named Edwin Hubble. Ever heard about the name Hubble before? The Hubble Space Telescope. Now you have the James Webb Telescope that's taking amazing photos of the universe, amazing photos of galaxies that are far beyond us as well. But Edwin Hubble came along, and he made some observations that actually confirmed Friedman and Latimer's theory, and some people call it actually the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century. And it was the redshift theory, where they saw that light waves were stretching as galaxies were moving further and further away from us. And they realized and came to the conclusion that the universe is expanding. The universe is becoming bigger. And so Friedman and Latimer's model or theory became what's known as the Big Bang theory, as you trace the initiation or the beginning of the universe back in time to a single point, and that the universe continues to expand. Now, there's other things to confirm this model or this theory, particularly Einstein's theory of relativity, the abundance of helium in the universe, and in 1965, the discovery of the cosmic background radiation. And I'm not going to go into all of that because it's going to become even a more science lesson than it already is. But there's lots of things to prove that the universe is expanding, that the universe had a beginning and it's continuing to expand. The second law of thermodynamics, which is a widely accepted law and principle, tells us that in a closed system like the universe, things will become increasingly disordered. And so in the closed system of the universe, for example, if you had a bottle and you put some gas into it, the gas is going to take up the whole space and take up all that. It's not just going to come into one section of the bottle. Similarly, for the universe, as it continues to expand, it's going to come to a state of equilibrium. It's going to come to a place of what scientists called heat death. However, if the universe was eternal, if the universe didn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end, why has not the universe come to a place of equilibrium, come to a place of heat death? And so scientists are looking at this and finally coming to the conclusion, because of so much evidence around, that the universe did have a beginning, that there was a start to it. And so if you go back to the Kalam cosmological argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so the question is, what is that cause? I think it's this. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is the initial mover. He is the first cause. He is the principal mover. And so we see that this wasn't accepted by the scientific community for many years. Physics professor J.M. Weisner said this: the Big Bang was hard to accept because you had to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world. And it also seemed to have a call for an act of supernatural creation. It took time, observational evidence, and careful verification of predictions made by the Big Bang model to convince the scientific community to accept the idea of a cosmic genesis, a successful model that imposed itself on a reluctant scientific community. So if you go back to this Kalam cosmological argument that whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. If we look at the evidence rationally, it's more rational to believe that God exists than that he doesn't exist. Francis Collins says this about the Big Bang. The Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defining beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. And so when you look at the evidence, when you see where is the cause of this? Izzy read for us from Psalm 8. When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, the amazing things. We're just getting a tiny glimpse of it. If you look and study a little bit of what's happening around us in all of the universe, the James Webb Telescope is seeing so many amazing photos of amazing galaxies moving at amazing speeds. We're here just on this little planet Earth. that's revolving around the sun, that's moving at such a fast rate, our galaxy is moving at such a tremendous speed as well. And to think of the star breather, who in just a line in the book of Genesis says, he made the stars also. Isn't it amazing that we serve such a wonderful and great creator who speaks things into existence? He is that cause. He is that first mover. He is that initial cause. Lastly, the third thing, the question of design. When we look at the world around us, we can look and see that the universe around us, the world in which we live here on planet Earth, is so finely tuned for the existence of life that for it to happen by chance, it would take more faith to believe that it happened by chance than to believe that God exists. Going back to my thesis and principle argument, it takes that there is more evidence to show more rational belief that God exists than that he doesn't exist. It's what's called the anthropic principle in science, where we can observe various constants in the universe, various principles within the universe, and see that it is so finely tuned to the existence of life. Here's a few of them that Norman Geisler and Frank Turek outline in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I'll go through them quickly. Number one, oxygen level on Earth. 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. If it were 25%, there would be spontaneous fires. If it was 15%, we would suffocate. It's a great level for us, okay? Atmospheric transparency, okay? If it were too, If it were too transparent, then there would be too much solar radiation, meaning the radiation from the sun, that comes to the earth. If it were less transparent, then there wouldn't be enough, okay? The moon and earth gravitational interaction. If it was more, tidal waves and other things would be too severe. If it were less, orbital changes would bring climate instability. Life on earth would be impossible, okay? There's so many things that are here. Carbon dioxide level. If the CO2 level were higher, there would be too much greenhouse effect and we would burn up. If the levels were lower, then plants could not have effective photosynthesis. There's so many different constants that are here, okay? How about gravity? If it was different than what it exactly is, it poses a problem for life on Earth. Gravity is exactly what it needs. And there's so many other things. There's centrifugal forces of planetary movements, the expansion rate of the universe, the speed of light, water vapor levels in the atmosphere, Jupiter's orbit, the thickness of the Earth's crust, the rotation of the Earth, the axis tilt of the Earth. If the Earth was on a slightly different axis, life wouldn't exist here on Earth. Atmospheric discharge rate, seismic activity. There's so much that's around us. It is so finely tuned so that life on Earth can exist. Would you think that would happen by chance? Would you think that all of these things come together and it would just take place? If you walked into a room and there was 100 dice on the floor and all of them said 6, would you think that someone just tossed 100 dice and it ended up being 6? Or would you think that somebody actually went through and made them all say 6, 6, 6? What do you think? Right? Well, I'm asking you the question, what do you believe more? I believe that there is more evidence to show that God exists than that he doesn't, right? Do I have 100% proof? No. But looking at the evidence, there's more evidence to show that God exists than that he doesn't. And if I walked into a room that had 100 dice on the floor and they all said 6, I would choose to believe that somebody put them that way, instead of the small possibility that happened randomly. The extent of the universe's fine-tuning makes the anthropic principle perhaps the most powerful argument for the existence of God. There's an astrophysicist, his name is Hugh Ross, and he tried to calculate the probability that life would exist on any other planet in the universe. And he made an assumption that there was 10 to the power of 22 planets in the universe. That's a lot of zeros after that 10, okay? That's 22 zeros after that 10. Do you know what his answer was? The probability that it would happen? 1 in 10 to the 138th power. That's 138 zeros after that. And one chance in that. You know what makes this statistic even more amazing? Is the fact that it's estimated there's 10 to the power of 70 atoms in the universe. Right? 10 to the power of 70 atoms in the entire universe. Again, assuming that there's 10 to the power of 22 planets in the universe. This makes it totally extraordinary. Nobel Prize winner Arnon Penzias said, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Now, there's an argument against this. It's called the multiverse. Ever heard of the multiverse? There's a TV show on Apple TV called, I believe it's called Dark Matter. Anyone has seen it before? It talks about, you're afraid to put up your hands. It talks about the multiverse, okay? Where this guy, he is not he's a brilliant scientist, okay? And he chooses his career over this girlfriend that he has. And so he goes down this pathway of his career and regrets that he didn't choose life with this beautiful woman that he had the opportunity of marrying. But as he goes down this scientific pathway, he is able to build this box on the principle of Schrodinger's cat, and that you can go into this box and it leads you into the multiverse. So what he does is he goes into the multiverse, he goes in this completely different universe, right? A universe in which he had married this beautiful woman and they built a beautiful and wonderful life together and had a child. And he says, I want that life now, so I'm going to leave my universe and go into this other universe and enjoy this wonderful life with this woman that I could have had. Because the multiverse says that every decision that we make, there's a different universe that plays out that decision. Sounds pretty interesting, right? So here's the question. Would you choose to believe in God? Or does it take a little bit more faith to actually believe in a multiverse? Does it take more faith to believe that there are multiple universes out there that are living out every single interaction, every single decision that we have? The premise of this message is that there is more evidence to show the existence of God than not. And as we look at the fine-tuning of the world, as we look at the anthropic principle and see how God has crafted the place where we live in such fine dimensions and constants that afford life, it's amazing and wonderful. If you were seated at a card table and somebody dealt out to you 100 or 1,000 straight flushes in a row, would you think you're lucky or someone set that up? Right? 1,000 straight flushes in a row? Somebody's probably stacking the deck, right? And so when you think about the probability of all of this happening versus the choice of a designer who loves us that has crafted this amazing world for us to live in, I think it takes more faith to be an atheist than to look at the evidence that is set before us. Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, one of his most famous books, says, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller even by 1 part in 100,000 million millions, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. That's a small little percentage there. I think the universe was finally crafted by a wonderful and loving God who said, in the beginning, God created everything. Francis Collins, who was the director of the Human Genome Project that mapped out our genome, which is amazing. Friends, in front of you, in the pew in front of you, there's a Bible that's there. Would you think, if you took that Bible and opened up and seen all the letters and the words that are crafted in that book, if you looked at that, would you have ever thought or said that all just came by chance? Well, when Francis Collins and his team mapped out the human genome, they saw the beautiful description of life in our DNA, the amount of information that is there in our DNA that speaks of the handiwork of God. And that if you look at something like that, it would take more faith to believe that DNA came about by chance than to believe that there was a creator and intelligent designer who wrote the language of love in our DNA. The atheist Richard Dawkins says that one amoeba has enough DNA to fill 1,000 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. Can you imagine how much information is coded and held within our own DNA? The language of love that God has written for us. Look at what the psalmist says in Psalm 139. You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. Do you know it? Do you know how marvelously complex you are? Handcrafted by the eternal God, written in the language of love, ordained from the foundation of the world, that God has a purpose and a plan. And so again, my appeal to you is to reason, to see the evidence before us, and to believe that there is more evidence to show that God exists than that he doesn't exist. Francis Collins won the Templeton Award a few years ago, and in his acceptance speech, he talked about his journey from atheism to theism and belief in Jesus. So take a look at this video as he talks about it.
Beginning with the reason I'm here tonight, let me say something about the perceived disharmony between science and faith. Nearly 6 in 10 adults in the U.S. say science and religion frequently conflict. Well, that was certainly my view as I was growing up in Virginia, without much of a spiritual perspective, but falling in love with the scientific method. Faith seemed to me to be the antithesis of the rational scientific approach that I wanted to pursue. And so I migrated, without much thought about it, into agnosticism and ultimately atheism. But then I moved from quantum mechanics to medical school, and the questions of the meaning of life and the reality of mortality were impossible to ignore. Science didn't help me much here. I was surrounded by patients and some of my professors for whom faith provided a way to wrestle with those profound questions. That was puzzling. Challenged by one of my patients to describe what I believed about God, I realized my atheism was dangerously thin. Seeking to prop this up, I began a journey to try to understand why intellectually sophisticated people could actually believe in God. And to my dismay, I found that atheism turned out to be the least rational of all the choices. To quote Chesterton, atheism is the most daring of all dogmas, for it is the assertion of a universal negative. Scientists aren't supposed to do that. Over a 2-year period, with much help from wise mentors and the writings of C.S. Lewis, I slowly and rather reluctantly came to the conclusion that belief in God, while not possible to prove, was the most rational choice available. Furthermore, I saw in the very science that I so loved something that I had missed, the evidence that seemed to cry out for a creator. There is something instead of nothing. The universe had a beginning. It follows elegant mathematical laws. And those laws include a half-dozen constants that have to have the exact value they do, or there would be no possibility of anything interesting or complex in nature. God must be an amazing physicist and mathematician. But would he or she actually care about me? The major world religions seem to say yes, but why should I trust that? And then I met the person who not only claimed to know those answers and to know God, but to be God. That was Jesus Christ. I had thought he was a myth, but the historical evidence for his real existence was utterly compelling, including his life, his death, and yes, even this, his resurrection. And as the truth of the New Testament sank in, I realized I was called to make a decision. In my 27th year, I could simply not resist any longer. With some trepidation, I knelt in the dewy grass on an October morning somewhere in the Cascades and I became a Christian. Friends in whom I confided my newfound faith predicted this would be short-lived. After all, I was by then a physician who was interested in studying genetics. Genetics means DNA. DNA means evolution. And by then, I was convinced that evolution was not only just a theory, it was supported by evidence that made it about as compelling as gravity. Surely, they said, my head would explode when the conflicts emerged. But that never happened.
Friends, as we look at the evidence before us, what will we choose to believe? I told you about Lee Strobel at the beginning of the message, and he posted this on X about his conclusion, and he said this: to continue in atheism, this is the author of The Case for Christ, as he investigated the claims of Jesus. To continue in atheism, I would need to believe that nothing produces everything. Non-life produces life. Randomness produces fine-tuning. Chaos produces information. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. And non-reason produces reason. I simply didn't have that much faith. Where will you put your faith today? Where will you put your trust? Is the evidence that's before you? Will we choose to believe? Will we choose to believe in a creator who says he loves us and cares for us? Choose to believe in a creator who came down from heaven to earth to die on the cross for you and for me, to show that great love? Will we choose to believe in a creator that has crafted us in our mother's womb, that's given us a moral framework by which we can live, not that's relativistic, but is based on his own character of love and kindness and grace? Will we choose to believe in the one who came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many? That's the choice that we have today. Can I encourage you, in whatever situation you find yourself in whatever suffering and trial and difficulty, in whatever thing that you're going through today where hope seems lost and the future seems unknown, remember that he has written and crafted in your DNA the language of love, that he has written and crafted in you his purposes, that you can be his child, that he gives us the privilege to call him Abba Father, that he gives us the privilege and the opportunity to be called the children of God, part of his family, loved by him. And as that prodigal son realized, as he came back to his father, who was waiting with open arms, let me tell you, friends, Jesus is waiting with open arms for you and for me. Let's choose to believe.